Alrighty, gentlemen, and we are rolling.
Okay. The first question about Palestine, or the issue of Palestine, is the new observer state. If you could tell us about your thoughts, the voting, and the indications and how important it is.
I think it was a useful step forward, but we should now speak of occupied Palestine, not the occupied territories. Of course, the significance of a General Assembly resolution depends on the willingness of the great powers, in particular the United States, to permit it to be implemented. Other than that, resolutions have no consequences. And in this case, the U.S., of course, voted against it. It has already punished the United Nations for even moving in that direction by defunding UNESCO, not for the first time. Israel, of course, right away announced that it would punish the Palestinians for pursuing this course and proceeded to do so with new settlements, new settlement plans, other devices. Theoretically, Palestine now has the option of approaching the International Criminal Court with charges against Israel for criminal acts in occupied, what's now occupied Palestine. But again, the chances of success depend very heavily, in fact, overwhelmingly, on whether the U.S. will permit anything to proceed. And that's unlikely. Might be educational and useful to try it anyhow, but we should recognize that this is not a world ruled by law. It's a world ruled by force, with some legal veneer, which is used occasionally, often used against the weak and defenseless. The International Criminal Court and the Hague tribunals are a good example. They don't bring to justice major criminals, leading war criminals from the West. They're used selectively against enemies of the West or defenseless individuals who may well be that the crimes, the sentences are justified, but they're highly selective. This applies generally. For example, in the domain of international law, the United States declared back in 1946, when it initiated the establishment of the International Court of Justice, that the United States would not be subject to any charges for violation of international law, meaning the UN Charter, Organization of American States, and so on. And the courts have abided by that. In the case brought by Yugoslavia against NATO, where one of the charges was genocide, the U.S. exempted itself from the case on the grounds that when the U.S. signed the Genocide Convention about 4 years after it was introduced, it had a reservation saying that it does not apply to the United States. And the court, following its rules, in fact, therefore excused the United States from the proceedings, proceeded against the other powers. And there are other cases. So international law is something that should be honored and defended, but without illusions. And in this case, the establishment of a Palestinian state with observer status should be used to whatever extent possible to extend human rights and justice, but it's not where the action is.
Do you think that the BDS movement would, in general, what are your thoughts? You think it would supplement that process and accelerate it?
The phrase, I think the tactics, BDS tactics, are very good tactics. But I'm always a little put off by the phrase BDS movement. So, for example, in the case of South Africa, which is a model, there was no BDS movement. There was a selective use of BDS tactics adapted to circumstances and designed so that they would be effective. And that's the right way to proceed. But as soon as we start talking about a BDS movement, it immediately calls to mind fixed principles, an authority that determines how the movement acts and so on, and that could be harmful, and in fact sometimes has been. Usage of the BDS tactics has sometimes been quite effective. Sometimes it's been harmful because it did not take into account the circumstances, the audience, the effect on the audience, or in fact has turned out to be harmful. So the tactics are very sensible ones, and they're not restricted to the so-called BDS movement. So, for example, I was involved in BDS activities years before the movement was ever started, and so were others. The major human rights organizations have also advocated use of these tactics, but they're not considered part of the BDS movement. So, for example, Human Rights Watch, the major one, has called on corporations, U.S. corporations, to refrain from any actions which would support settlement activities. The settlements are all illegal. It's not in doubt, and they recognize that. And have also called on the U.S. government not to participate in what in fact are criminal acts supporting the settlements. Those responsibilities extend to individuals as well, and they can meet these responsibilities by making use of BDS tactics when appropriate and well designed.
Now, if you allow me to move into the Arab Spring in general, and specifically to the Arab monarchs, social movement is kind of restrained by many factors. Me being a Saudi originally, one of the things that we see is the first thing is the synchronization between the religion, the power, the big business. Second thing, the working class is almost entirely imported. Who do you think that the responsibility of social change under such circumstances?
Well, the responsibility is different for different actors. For the Saudi regime, the responsibility would be to end repressive tactics and foster social justice and freedom. Well, they're not going to do that on their own. Mm-hmm. For outsiders, like say the Western powers, the responsibility would be to oppose in whatever way they can the use of the kinds of measures you described, certainly not to support them. And of course, they're doing the opposite, they're supporting them. The repression in Saudi Arabia has occasionally been pretty harsh, particularly in the Shiite regions along the Gulf, and there's no protest from the Western powers. They continue to, in effect, support them diplomatically, dispatching military means, and so on and so forth. In the case of Bahrain, there was a little media attention, but not that much, and in fact the U.S. and its allies continue to support the crushing of the effort to move towards reform. In Saudi Arabia, there was a weak attempt to join the Arab Spring with a Friday Day of Rage type demonstration, but security presence was so overwhelming, I don't think people even went out into the streets. In the cases where the Arab Spring has made some progress, primarily Tunisia and Egypt, one critical factor was the participation of the labor movement. Both countries have a history of labor activism and militancy, crushed by the dictatorship often, but nevertheless they're growing. And when they joined in the demonstrations and so on, that made a big difference. And in fact, one of the achievements of the Arab Spring so far, there are real achievements, so they're limited, has been to open up new possibilities for independent labor organizing. There, in Egypt, for example, after the overthrow of the Mubarak dictatorship, there have been a substantial number of labor actions, some of them pretty significant, and there have been the first serious steps towards forming an independent labor union, independent of the government-run, pseudo-union. Well, those are all important developments. Now, as you say, that's not going to happen in Saudi Arabia unless the labor movement is free. But when the labor movement is imported, they have no rights, and they're harshly repressed, and they can't possibly begin to act in their own interest. And that should be overcome to grant the labor rights that do fall under the International Labor Organization principle and others, and other means of organizing and activism. That's a long haul. The religious controls in Saudi Arabia are enormous, of course. Saudi Arabia is the most extreme fundamentalist state in the world. Furthermore, it exports its fundamentalism. It's a missionary state, and it's had a pernicious effect elsewhere. So in Pakistan, for example, under the Zia-ul-Haq dictatorship, Saudi money poured in to establish extremely reactionary religious schools, many of the madrasas, which have had a very harmful effect on Pakistan, on radical Islamization of it and undermining its own democracy and freedom. And in the countries where the Arab Spring has had some progress, like Egypt and Tunisia, apparently Saudi money is again pouring in to support the most extreme radical Islamist groups, Salafis, and all of this is, I think, very harmful to as well as just the preaching of the fundamentalist religion, but quite over and above often applying it quite brutally within Saudi Arabia. So these are all serious problems that should be overcome. And one reason why it's hard to overcome them is they're supported by the Western powers. In fact, traditionally, Britain, then the United States, have tended to support Islamic fundamentalist extremism in opposition to secular nationalism. That's a traditional pattern. You can understand that secular nationalism is what threatened the control of the Western powers over oil production, which is what they're most in distribution, which is what they're most interested in, and always carried with it the threat that the energy resources of the region would be directed to the needs of the people of the region, and not to enriching Western corporations, domestic elite, strengthening Western powers in their strategic power over the world. It's a sort of that's oversimplified, but that's been the major tendency. And as long as citizens of the West permit their own governments to act that way, and they don't have to, then it's going to be quite hard to carry out reformist, liberating efforts in the Gulf dictatorships, not just Saudi Arabia.
If you allow me one last question?
Sure.
Is this one of the things that I, growing up, tend to think about, and I basically compared it to the situation of Robespierre with the French Revolution. for example, importing labor. It was for a long time, growing up, it was actually a source of pride that our people don't have to do those kind of jobs. But do you think such plans as this is consciously objective, based on total domination, eliminating revolutions and such?
I can't penetrate the thinking of the Saudi elite or the GCC elite, but I presume that they just see it as a part of their privilege. They are the beneficiaries of enormous resources. They regard themselves as the just rulers on religious and other grounds, and therefore they bring in what amount to serfs routinely, just as feudal nobles do, without any particular ideology behind it. It's our right. We're rich, we're powerful, they're powerless and impoverished. We'll do with them what we like. That's pretty much the same in other countries. So take, say, Israel, which is not a religious feudal state, but the Israeli economy depends significantly on imported labor, which in Israel is sometimes even essentially called slave labor. It used to exploit Palestinians for these purposes, but after it decided to rid itself of the Palestinians, it's essentially been surviving on the wreckage of international neoliberal policies, which leave great masses of people suffering and hopeless throughout the world, and they can become kind of slave labor force, like undocumented immigrants in the United States. That's unfortunately a very common practice for the Gulf dictatorships. It's almost second nature.